the gentleman was there in bed with her. So we got into a verbal altercation, and one thing led to another. Now, what happened next it's kind of a blur to me. I'm still hungover and still a little drunk, but one thing led to another. The first shot was from over 6 to 8 feet away. It's just a big blur after that. She got in the middle of us fighting. It happened so fast.
On January 28, 2026, after spending more than 26 years on death row, Charles Victor Thompson was executed in Texas. But to understand how he reached that point, we need to go back to 1997, when jealousy and a need for control set off a chain of events that led to a double shooting, a death sentence, a jail escape, and nearly 3 decades on death row. It all started in the summer of 1997 when 27-year-old Chuck started dating Dennise, who was 38 years old at the time. Before long, he moved into the home she shared with her son, her co-worker Lisa, and Lisa's 2 daughters. At first, it looked like a fresh start, a blended household trying to make things work, but it didn't stay that way for long. Chuck's jealousy kept growing, and so did his temper. When he got angry, he threw things, kicked the refrigerator, and punched the walls so hard he left holes in them. And it didn't stop there. Chuck rarely worked, leaving Dennise and Lisa to carry all the financial weight, and when Lisa finally asked him to help pay the bills, his anger only got worse. One night, Lisa heard him screaming at Dennise, and when she peeked into the bedroom, she saw him grabbing and shaking her. Lisa tried to pull him away, but he turned on her instead and threw her to the ground. When she tried to call the police afterward, she discovered the phone line was dead. The cord had been ripped right out of the wall. Not long after, Chuck moved out, while Dennise got her own apartment and tried to start over. But the pattern didn't stop. On March 16, 1998, the 3 of them went to a local pub. As the night went on, Chuck became possessive and controlling, demanding that Dennise sit with him and not dance with anyone else. And when Lisa saw Dennise days later, her face was bruised, her lips split, and there were marks around her neck. By then, though, Dennise had already started spending time with Darren, a bartender she had met at a local bar. He was friendly, patient, and well-liked. Everything locals say Chuck wasn't. They were just friends at that time, but Darren could tell something was wrong in Dennise's life. On the night of April 29, 1998, he called his best friend Tony to see if he wanted to watch a game, but Tony declined, and the night moved on. But a few hours later, around 2:30 in the morning, Darren called again, this time sounding urgent. He said Dennise was being threatened and hurt, and that he was heading to her apartment to help her. But what he didn't know was that he was walking straight into a deadly situation. Early that morning, Chuck showed up at Dennise's apartment unannounced, and as soon as he saw Darren, an argument broke out. Dennise's neighbor, Catherine, woke up around 3 a.m. to her dog barking and the sound of someone screaming. From inside her home, she heard a woman crying, "Stop!" and "Help!" She immediately called the police and stepped outside to check the apartment numbers, trying to figure out exactly where the commotion was coming from. She saw Dennise and Darren standing outside near the apartment. At first glance, neither of them looked physically hurt, but Dennise was clearly shaken, talking fast and apologizing to Darren for all of this. Then Chuck came storming out of the apartment. He was yelling and cursing, calling Dennise a whore. Darren tried to calm him down, telling him to chill. But instead of backing off, Chuck looked at Darren and yelled, "Do you want to die, motherfucker?" At that point, Deputy William Coker arrived in response to the disturbance call, and he immediately noticed Chuck's face. It was swollen and bruised, a visible sign there had been a fight. And as he started asking questions, it quickly became clear that Chuck was the one who had started it, not the victim. Still, nobody wanted to press charges, and without a formal complaint, there wasn't much he could do. So William did the only thing he could. He ordered Chuck to leave the complex, then followed him as he drove away, and warned him that if he came back, it wouldn't be just a fight anymore. It would be criminal trespass. And with that, he left. thinking the situation had been resolved. But he was wrong, very wrong. Because just a couple of hours later, around 6 a.m., Chuck came back, and this time he wasn't there to talk. He was armed with a 9mm handgun, and he was ready to use it. Chuck walked up to the front door of Denise's apartment and kicked it in. The door blew open, waking Darren and Dennise. But before either of them could fully react, Chuck was already in the bedroom, standing over them with the gun raised. He fired 4 shots into Darren's neck and chest at close range. The bullets tore through his vital organs, and Darren collapsed instantly and died within seconds. Then Chuck turned to Dennise. She screamed and tried to get away, but there was nowhere to go. Chuck told her, "I can shoot you too, bitch." While he reloaded, aimed, and fired. The bullet hit her in the face, entering through her cheek. It shattered her dentures, nearly severed her tongue, and caused catastrophic internal damage. Dennise dropped to the floor, badly hurt, but somehow she was still alive. At that exact moment, Catherine's son was heading out the door for school when he heard the gunshots. And not long after, Catherine heard pounding on her front door. When she stepped outside, she saw Dennise on the ground, struggling to breathe and unable to speak. Dennise lifted her hands and mimicked someone firing a gun, desperately trying to show Catherine what had just happened. When Deputy William Coker rushed back to the apartment complex, the calm from earlier was gone. Now it was chaos. William knelt beside Dennise and asked, "Did Chuck shoot you?" And Dennise nodded. When William looked up, Chuck was nowhere in sight. He had already fled the scene. On his way out, he tossed the gun into a nearby creek and tried to disappear. But he didn't go very far. Instead, he drove to the home of a friend, Diane Zernia, arriving as she was getting her daughter ready for school. She let him in, and Chuck sat down in the living room. You might expect him to be pacing, panicking, but instead he did something almost unreal. He fell asleep. After Diane's daughter left for school, the house went quiet. Diane turned on the news, and that's when she saw it. A story about the shooting at Denise's apartment. She sat there watching while Chuck slept just a few feet away. Then, hours later, he finally woke up. Trying to break the tension, Diane made a joke about his black eye and said, "I hope the other guy looks worse." And Chuck answered, "He does. I shot him." He later called his father and told him what had happened. His father convinced him to turn himself in, and that same morning, Chuck walked into the police station and was arrested on the spot, initially charged with manslaughter. Back at the apartment, paramedics had done everything they could. Darren was already gone, while Dennise was barely clinging to life. She was airlifted to Herman Hospital, where doctors struggled to save her. The gunshot had severely damaged her airway, and swelling made it hard to get a breathing tube in place. Despite all their efforts, Denise's body was failing, and she slipped into a coma. A week later, with no hope of recovery, her family made the heartbreaking decision to remove life support. Dennise died on May 6, 1998. Chuck didn't know it yet, but Denise's death would change everything for him. At his trial in 1999, Chuck admitted that he was the one who fired the shots. He didn't deny that. But his defense argued something unusual. They said that Denise's death wasn't actually Chuck's fault. According to them, the hospital was to blame. Their medical expert, Dr. Paul Radalat, testified that the staff at Herman Hospital made serious mistakes placing her breathing tube and that Dennise went without oxygen for 5 to 10 minutes. That lack of oxygen, he said, caused brain damage and led to the decision to take her off life support. If the hospital hadn't made those mistakes, the defense claimed, Dennise might have survived, and Chuck would only be facing life in prison. But the prosecution hit back hard. The medical examiner and lead surgeon testified that Denise's wound was so severe that she was in immediate danger from the moment she was shot. Her tongue had been nearly severed, and that injury alone, they explained, was life-threatening. Even Dr. Radalat eventually admitted on cross-examination that Dennise probably would have died without any medical treatment. Legally, that mattered. A lot. Under Texas law, a person can be held criminally responsible for a death if it wouldn't have happened but for their actions. In this case, the jury was asked a simple but crucial question. Would Dennise have been in that hospital fighting for her life if Chuck hadn't shot her in the face? And their answer was clear. They concluded that it was Chuck's decision to pull the trigger and not anything the hospital did that was the true cause of her death. And because of that, he was eligible for the ultimate punishment. And on April 14, 1999, he received his final verdict. Charles Victor Thompson was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution had presented evidence that Chuck posed a future danger to society, and they had proof. While Chuck was being held in the Harris County Jail awaiting trial, he didn't lay low. Instead, he approached other inmates with a disturbing request. He wanted someone to kill Diane Zernia, the friend he had confessed to after the shooting. She could directly link him to the crime, and he wanted her silenced, permanently. An undercover investigator named Gary Johnson posed as a hitman and met with Chuck in a visitor's booth, wearing a hidden wire.
I just need to get rid of her. She's the state's witness. She's the only witness they got. Okay.
During their recorded conversation, Chuck offered him $1,500 to retrieve the gun from the creek and murder Diane. He even drew a map to her house, described her family, her vehicles, and even the layout of her home, all to help this hitman carry out the job. The evidence was devastating. Chuck wasn't just a man who had killed, he was trying to arrange another murder from behind bars. In 2001, however, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the undercover operation violated his Sixth Amendment rights, and they overturned his death sentence. A new sentencing trial was ordered. So, in 2005, prosecutors had to prove Chuck's future dangerousness all over again, this time without the undercover testimony. They called another jailhouse witness, Robin Rhodes, who testified that Chuck had given him a hit list of witnesses and told him to either kill them or convince them not to testify. Even though the defense attacked Robin as a full-time informant who had worked with law enforcement in over 50 cases, the jury believed him. And on October 28, 2005, Chuck was sentenced to death for the second time. But Chuck wasn't finished yet. Just days after receiving his second death sentence, he pulled off one of the most audacious jail escapes in Texas history.
A dragnet over Houston as police search for a convicted killer, a death row inmate who, they say, simply walked out of jail in Houston. How?
Thompson smuggled street clothes that he wore for a court appearance back to his jail cell and then found a way to change in a booth like this one, a booth used for meetings between attorneys and inmates.
On November 3, 2005, Chuck was still being held in the Harris County Jail, waiting to be transferred to death row at the Huntsville Unit in Livingston. But what no one knew was that he had been planning his escape for weeks. Inmates were allowed to keep a legal binder in their cells, and Chuck used his like a toolkit. Hidden inside were a handcuff key, a fake ID badge, and a full set of civilian clothes, khaki pants, a dark blue shirt, and white tennis shoes. That afternoon, Chuck told guards he had a meeting with his attorney. They escorted him to a visitor room, cuffed like any other inmate. But once he was alone, he slipped out of the handcuffs, changed clothes, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the jail's security checkpoints, guards stopped him just like they were supposed to. But Chuck didn't panic. He flashed the fake ID badge, which claimed he was a state investigator with the Attorney General's office, and, unbelievably, it worked. He repeated this 4 times, bluffing his way past guard after guard until he reached the front entrance. Then, just like that, he stepped through the door of a maximum security jail in broad daylight, and no one stopped him. Later, even he admitted he couldn't believe it. "I was stunned that I made it out without being swarmed by deputies," he told reporters. Once he was free, Chuck hopped onto a freight train heading toward East Texas, spent the night in an open boxcar, then made his way to Shreveport, Louisiana. There, he stole a bike and pretended to be a Hurricane Katrina evacuee to get money from strangers, planning to collect enough cash to reach Canada. but he didn't make it. On November 6th, just 3 days after his escape, Chuck's freedom came to an end. Acting on a tip, police found Chuck intoxicated at a payphone outside a liquor store in Shreveport. He was trying to call friends overseas to arrange a wire transfer. He was arrested without a fight and sent back to Texas. For the next 20 years, Chuck sat on death row at the Huntsville Unit, filing appeal after appeal, arguing ineffective counsel, improper evidence, and constitutional violations. But every court upheld the verdict and the sentence. Then, in 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal. There were no more options left. On September 11, 2025, his death warrant was signed. His execution was scheduled for January 28, 2026. It would be the first execution under the leadership of Harris County District Attorney Sean Tier. For the families of Dennise Hayslip and Darren Cain, the wait had been long and painful. 27 years had passed since that brutal night. When the death warrant was signed, friends and family of Darren were in the courtroom, and according to the prosecutor, they had been looking forward to this day very much. In the weeks leading up to his scheduled execution, Chuck gave interviews from death row and expressed deep remorse for what he had done. "It's tragic what happened," he said. "I regret it. I have remorse. I want people to be able to heal and move past it. I pray for them, and I've asked them to forgive me." But he also continued to insist that the hospital had some responsibility for Dennise's death. "If she had survived, my maximum sentence would have been life in prison," he said. On September 11th, Chuck was moved to Death Watch, an isolated cell at the Huntsville Unit with a toilet, a sink, a metal bed, and a camera monitoring him 24 hours a day. 2 hours of recreation, 5 days a week. That was his life now. Chuck talked to his parents often, but they hadn't visited in person in years. He had a daughter, now 34, and a son, 31. He and his daughter had stayed close. But in his final days, it wasn't family sitting with him. It was his pen pals. The day before his execution, one supporter sat with him in the visiting room for 9 hours, and when the sun came up on January 28th, they came back. They were there by 8 a.m., sitting with him again, while everyone waited on a last-minute ruling from the Court of Criminal Appeals. Even with a few hours left to live, he was calm, steady, and still holding on to hope. Outside the prison, his pen pals were refreshing court dockets and news feeds. But the stay never came. The preparations continued. Under Texas law, inmates can no longer request a special last meal. He was offered a meal from the day's prison menu that featured fried chicken, scrambled eggs, and other items. By 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. In his final words, Chuck turned to the families of his victims and asked them to find it in their hearts to forgive him, saying he hoped they could begin to heal and move past this. "There are no winners in this situation," he said, after a spiritual advisor prayed over him for several minutes and just before the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. He told the witnesses that his execution creates more victims and traumatizes more people 28 years later. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for what happened," he added. "And I want to tell all of y'all I love you and to keep Jesus in your life. Keep Jesus first." As the injection began to take effect, Chuck took a series of heavy breaths, then grew quiet and still. He was pronounced dead 22 minutes after the drug started flowing. Charles Victor Thompson was 55 years old. What do you think? Has justice been served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.